House of Commons Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format. I would like to remind participants of the following points. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. All comments should be addressed through the chair. Members, please raise your hand if you wish to speak, whether participating in person or via Zoom. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best we can. Pursuant to Standing Order 108 Sub 2 and the motion adopted on September 19th, 2024, the committee is resuming its study of Russian interference and disinformation campaigns in Canada. Did you have a... Mr.
Thanks.
Moss?
I had a question for the clerk just before we start, if that's okay, Chair. I understand some of the witnesses have not been responding to your outreach. There were 3 witnesses that were named in our study that we all unanimously agreed to: Liam Donovan, Lauren Chen, and Lauren Southern. And I'm just wondering, first of all, have you heard back from them at all?
They've been contacted twice and no answers were provided.
So I'm wondering if the committee was agreeable that the clerk send a letter from committee members inviting them again, but having it come from the members of the committee this time. And also, I mean, we do have powers beyond just an invitation if we want folks to appear, just listing what our options are if they choose not to respond.
I'll take that as a motion. Do we have consent, unanimous consent? Yes? Very well, thank you.
Thanks, Chair.
Okay, so we'd now like to welcome our witnesses for the first hour. As an individual, we have Anton Tchaikovskov, and I apologize for the pronunciation, a visiting professor from Central European University by video conference. We have from RESET, we have Ben Scott, Chief Executive Officer. And so I now invite Mr. Tchaikovskov to make an opening statement of up to 5 minutes. Please go ahead, sir.
Dear Mr. Chair, dear committee member, thank you for your kind invitation. Dear ladies and gentlemen, members of Parliament, it is my long-term observation that Russia is waging a...
Excuse me, sir, you're breaking up on us here. What can we do here? Maybe for the moment, while we like to see you, maybe you shut your video off. Maybe I'll give you more bandwidth for your speech. Okay, try again, please.
Is it better now, Mr. Chair?
The sound is much better now. Thank you. Go ahead. Start from the top if you wish.
So it is my long-term observation that Russia is waging a political warfare against Western nations. And by political warfare, I imply, not necessarily limited to the context of the Russian activities, a grey area in international relations where nations influence the behavior and thinking of others using methods beyond legitimate instruments such as diplomacy and soft power, yet not escalating to open military conflict using regular armed forces. Russian political warfare against the West is nothing new, but it has escalated since 2022, when Western nations decided to provide political, military, and economic support to Ukraine in its defensive war against the full-scale Russian aggression. As a country in the world's top 10 donors to Ukraine, Canada is one of the targets of Russian political warfare. In the context of the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, one prominent element of Russian political warfare against the West, including Canada, is information war, in which Russia advances 2 types of narratives: strategic and tactical. Strategic narratives reflect genuine, deep-seated beliefs of the Russian leadership linked to Ukraine or the broader context of the aggression. Strategic narratives demonstrate some internal logic and are generally coherent, although that does not imply that they are right or correct. 3 major strategic narratives related to the Russian invasion and directed at the West, including Canada, are as follows. First, Russia is a global power that has a right to have its own sphere of influence, and Ukraine belongs there. Second, Ukraine as part of the West poses an existential threat to Russia. And third, NATO is using Ukraine to wage a war against Russia. Tactical narratives serve as an individual steps that aim to strengthen the validity of strategic narratives or respond to emergent themes and current events and developments related to the Russian aggression. Unlike strategic narratives, however, tactical narratives are less coherent because they are extremely manipulative and usually appeal to emotions. There are many dozens of tactical narratives produced by the Russian information warfare machine. I will highlight some of them that are especially relevant for Canada. First, Ukraine is run by Nazis. Russia defends Russian people from Ukrainian Nazis. Canada has an immense Nazi problem. Or Western sanctions are damaging for Western businesses and households. Ukraine is one of the most corrupt countries in the world. It cannot be part of the West. Financial aid sent to Ukraine is being pocketed by corrupt Ukrainian leaders and officials. The West attacks Russia because of inherent Western Russophobia or hatred of Russians. Ukrainian nationalists heavily influence policy decisions of the Canadian authorities. Western weapons given to Ukraine will end up with international terrorists or on the black market. Providing military aid to Ukraine does not help Ukraine win the war. It only extends the suffering of Ukrainians. And the West should not oppose Russia because it can eventually use nuclear weapons. Russian pro-regime stakeholders use a wide range of instruments in their attempt to deliver both strategic and tactical narratives to targeted audiences. I identify 5 major types of these instruments. First type, official Russian channels. Statements by the Russian president and his presidential administration, statements by Russian ministries, especially foreign ministry and defense ministry. Second instrument, Russian state-controlled media, especially those producing contents in English language. Third, social network accounts openly or secretly run by Russian pro-regime stakeholders. Fourth, Western-based agents of malign Russian influence. Be them experts, journalists, celebrities, producers, politicians, businesses, religious organizations, namely entities in Western countries created and or used by Russian pro-regime stakeholders to conceal the pro-Russian agenda of the people behind them. While the main objective of the Russian information warfare, which relies on our views, support for Ukraine's defensive efforts, Russian pro-regime stakeholders appear to rely on a three-tier approach in evaluating the efficiency of their information operations. The first one is delivery. 1/3 of success of a particular information operation is the successful delivery of a strategic or tactical narrative to a targeted audience. So if the audience, which is targeted, consumes that narrative, that is 1/3 of success. The second tier is legitimacy. So 2/3 of success is when a malign narrative was not only consumed by a target audience, but also became one of legitimate points of view in Western mainstream discussions. For example, in the media or in the parliament. And the third is the acceptance. A complete success of a malign influence operation is achieved when a viewpoint rooted in a malign narrative produced by Russian stakeholders is not only seen as legitimate, but it is also
Sir, you're breaking up again.
Stop my initial presentation here, and I
Rappel au
will
règlement,
stop
Monsieur le Président.
here and answer any.
Okay. The latter part of your speech was a little choppy. Madame Michaud, allez-y, s'il vous plaît.
Oui, l'interprète.
The interpreter was mentioning that the sound was cutting out, so it was very hard for him to interpret. We got the majority of the testimony, however, but I'm not sure during the question period if that will also be a problem. One moment, please.
So we'll have to see how things progress, but we can ask his opening statement to be translated and distributed to the members as well, if that's okay. Okay, we go now to Mr. Scott to make opening statement of up to 5 minutes. Please go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. It's a pleasure to be back before the Canadian Parliament. I spent several years living in Canada and have a great deal of respect for the work that you do. I am the CEO of Reset Tech. We're a global nonprofit that works to support research and policy development and public attention focused on fighting digital threats to democracy, including the kinds of Russian information operations targeting democratic states that we're here to talk about today. I have done quite a bit of work with my team looking at the case of Tenet Media, which has sparked this hearing. So I want to talk a little bit about what Tenet Media looks like. I think all the members of the committee are likely familiar with the details of this case, but just to recap, this was revealed in a sweeping indictment by the Department of Justice back in September, just over a month ago, and indicated that a company based in Tennessee, but which importantly is a subsidiary of a Montreal-based company run by two Canadians, Lauren Chen and her husband, Liam Donovan, were paid by the Russians $10 million to subsidize the production of video and social media content that was distributed over all of the major social media platforms by the two of them, as well as a set of 6 other influencers, including Lauren Southern, another prominent Canadian social media influencer. I think it's notable that a lot of the media attention has described this activity as focused on the U.S. market, but I think it's really important to note how much of the content had a Canadian focus and how much Russian information operations that we have observed over the years have not distinguished much between an American audience and a Canadian audience. The Russian tactics, as a professor's comments clearly illustrate, is intended to divide and to destabilize with disinforming and conspiratorial narratives. And that's certainly true for Canada as much as it is for the US. I want to highlight here for you in my opening remarks some of the evidence that we've uncovered in our forensic work to look at what Tenet Media did with its $10 million in Russian funding. First, all of these accounts that Tenet was subsidizing across all social media platforms had a total subscriber base of about 16 million, which is quite large. What does that mean in terms of total audience? Well, over the course of the last year, we were able to see Tenet Media channels on Twitter alone got 20 billion impressions. 20 billion impressions on Twitter alone over the course of the last year. Add to that an additional 1.1 billion video views. Those are across YouTube, TikTok, and Rumble. And the creation of a podcast, the Rubin Report, which is consistently ranked in the top 0.01% of podcasts in the world. This is a very successful social media influencer campaign that has a variety of important features, not least of which is something that's been called by the researcher community something called the Elon effect. This essentially means tweeting at Elon Musk, who has a giant social media presence on X, Twitter, to try to get him to retweet or amplify posts. He amplified Tenet Media posts 70 times over the course of the last year, dramatically increasing the audience for this content. So what does this mean? How is this relevant for us in evaluating the threat level posed by the Kremlin and information operations? I think we need to be very concerned. The Kremlin is innovating. They used to buy Facebook ads. They used to do little bits and pieces of influence campaigns, which I'm happy to talk about some of the others that we've seen over the years in the question and answer part of this hearing. But for now, I think it's important to note that $10 million for 20 billion impressions is extraordinary value for money. And it means that we can fully expect that we will see more attacks of this kind if we already don't have them in the marketplace today. The only reason that this one was discovered was because of FBI signals intelligence intercepts on the Russians who were supplying the funding to Tenet Media. So it's very difficult to detect. And I think it's important to call out the fact that the Silicon Valley companies who run these platforms, with all of their money and talent, do not seem to have any kind of defenses in place to protect against this kind of dark money payola that's using social media channels to secretly influence public opinion in both Canada and the United States. I think it's an urgent issue. I think it is critical that this inquiry is happening and that Canadian forces in law enforcement and in national security pay close attention and develop defensive measures. Thank you very much for your time. I look forward to the questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you both. We'll go now to our questions. We'll start with Ms. Dancho for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Lloyd is going to take my time.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank both witnesses. Actually, my wrist is really hurting from all the notes I've been taking on your testimony. It's been very interesting. Mr. Shekhovtsov, is that correct pronunciation, sir?
Shekhovtsov.
Shekhovtsov, apologies. How important is it in supporting the fight in Ukraine to present a united front in countries?
Ukraine is heavily Mr. Chair. Ukraine is heavily dependent on external support for its defensive war. What is more important is the unity that Western nations have exhibited since the very beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And although in Europe there are some problematic cases in some member states of the European Union, still Ukraine heavily relies also on the American and Canadian support. And in this case, the consensus, the solidarity of Western nations for Ukraine is crucial. It is existential for Ukraine's fight for its independence and sovereignty today. And of course, Russia or Russian malign actors related to the Kremlin, to the Russian authorities, understand how important this consensus and solidarity are, and they are trying all they can to ruin this solidarity, to create divisions, to create polarization, to undermine that solidarity and support for Ukraine, and hence the information attacks.
Thank you. And so I don't think I'm putting words in your mouth by reiterating what you said, that there is a strong consensus in support of Ukraine in countries like Canada, correct?
This is my understanding, looking at the some data on support that Canada gives to Ukraine, and I mentioned in my speech, I'm really sorry if the audio quality was not enough, but Canada, as far as I know, is in top 10 of the world's donors to Ukraine. So, of course, this is extremely important.
I'm certainly very proud of Canada's long-standing support of Ukraine, especially starting in 2014 with Operation Unifier, training the Ukrainian forces, of which a number of my friends in the Canadian Armed Forces went over there to do that. In a country like Canada, though, sometimes our political debates and partisanship leads to political parties accusing other political parties of not being supportive of Ukraine, including some cases from the Liberal Party where they've accused the Conservative Party of being in the back pocket of Vladimir Putin. Is it helpful for our strong consensus on Ukraine to have the governing political party accuse the opposition party of being, like, how does that help build consensus, or is that bringing down the consensus by creating these divisive debates?
Mr. Chair, I think this is not in my position, or it's not for me to give comments on the political parties competing with each other in Canada. I'm grateful to all the parties in Canada that are providing support for Ukraine. And I would like really not to comment on the political debate.
I understand. I'll kind of put this more generally for you. You talked about how one part of the success of the Russian operation is for the consumption of the disinformation and misinformation that they're spreading. And then the second part is, once that has been consumed, when it becomes part of the debate. And so if there is a debate now about which political parties do or do not support Ukraine, when there has been, as you have said, a strong consensus in support of Ukraine, Is that kind of considered success by Russia when there's a perception being created that there is no consensus of political support for Ukraine in a country like Canada?
Mr. Chair, I think in this case it is important to highlight that only a full acceptance of a particular malign information narrative produced in Russia can be considered a success, a full success of this malign operation. When there are divisions, when there are some, disinformation narratives spread in the mainstream media, this is only part of success. This is not the only one. I'm sure that, for example, all of you heard that one of the most popular narratives of the Russian propaganda that Ukrainians are Nazis and Ukraine has a Nazi problem. Just the mere fact that you know about this narrative, it is also part of success, just knowing about this. But it does not mean that the full operation, the entire information operation of Russia has been successful.
That, Canada has a role, like we've sent observers to help out in elections in countries like Ukraine. We see that there are Russian interference in other countries' elections, including the country of Georgia that's upcoming. How concerned are you about Russian influence campaigns in those countries as well, and how do you think Canada can play a role in strengthening those countries' democratic institutions?
Mr. Chair, I am concerned about the developments in Georgia. In September, I published a report on how Russian political warfare also concerns Georgia and what actors in Georgia are essentially amplifying Russian propaganda and disinformation. And the elections that will be held in Georgia later this month, I think that they will be crucial for democracy, not only in Georgia, but also, in a way, in this part of the still what is called post-Soviet space.
Thank you, sir.
As far as I know, Canada is also part of the OSCE and participates in the OSCE ODIHR missions, and I hope that Canada will continue participating in those monitoring missions, including Georgia. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We go now to Ms. Demoff for 6 minutes, please. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. And just before I start, I noticed yesterday Ms. Dancho said she was going to disrupt today's meeting with bringing forward a motion. It's unfortunate when we have such experts with us for this testimony, studying something that former Public Safety Minister and High Commissioner for the UK called a crisis situation, that the Conservatives would want to stall and disrupt this meeting. So let's hope that she changes her mind and we can actually hear from the witnesses. I'm going to start with Mr. Scott. Beyond Ukraine messaging from Russia, what other kinds of messages was Russia sending through tenant media?
Primary messages that you see in tenant media creative are, I would call, a standard culture war playbook. They are aimed at some of the most divisive issues in Western society at the moment, questions around immigration, questions around LGBTQ rights, questions around the validity of climate change, and of course, as a professor has very clearly explained, an aggressive messaging campaign to try to undermine support for Ukraine. These are consistently reiterated across all of the tenant media channels.
Thank you. I know, I think Ukraine is one that we've heard a lot about, but I'm hearing as an MP in my office where Canadians are expressing concerns about climate change, for example, and we're hearing a lot about that from the party opposite me, immigration, LGBTQ issues, all of those filtered beyond tenant media and their 16 million subscribers to Canadians. And I'm wondering if you could tell us, Mr. Scott, about the vulnerabilities that everyday Canadians have to this kind of messaging.
I think it's quite significant, especially when you consider the way in which social media platforms function and how they make money and what kind of content they reward and monetize. So when you have channels like Tenet Media, which are hyperbolic and which are intentionally provocative, what happens, of course, is, hey, human nature, it draws eyeballs and people pay attention to that. And then the algorithm that is curating content on TikTok or on YouTube simply serves up more content of a similar type. The more we see things, the more normal they seem, and the more normalized they become in our political rhetoric, and the less extreme they seem to us from a political standpoint that used to have this center line. It begins to move, because how extreme can something be if it seems like everybody on social media is talking about it? So this is the pattern that we see in digital media marketplaces, which gradually leads towards a polarization of rhetoric. This is extremely divisive, not only because it distorts the representation of public opinion, but also because this is so heavily rewarded. It's not that Tenet Media relied exclusively on Russian secret dark money to run their operation. They also made a lot of money on advertising from the likes of YouTube and TikTok, who also make a lot of money from this kind of overt, hyper-politicized content without any effort to determine, hey, where is this coming from? Could this be an influence operation? What are our responsibilities in terms of public safety and national security?
Thank you. I'm going to switch to Mr. Shakovtsov, and I probably got it wrong, but you've written extensively on the influence that Russia had through social media on French President Macron, as well as German Chancellor Angela Merkel. Are you seeing that kind of influence here in Canada and our current leadership in the government?
Mr. Chair, I think I should say that Germany and France are the main targets of the Russian operations in Europe, and for North America, it's still the United States of America that is the primary target. So Russia, I can't say that Russia is, going around the West and interfering in all the elections. They do have their limits where they can interfere, where they have resources, where they maybe even have allies to interfere. In some countries, it's very difficult for them. So in a way, Canada is not a priority for the Russian operations, although the fact that so many.
I only have a minute left. On that, though, if we are seeing Russian influence through Tenet Media on climate change and immigration, for example, and then if you have political parties that have differing views, is that not going to influence Canadians' perceptions of those political parties, given the disinformation that's put out there?
You're absolutely right. Of course, all the content that is produced, say, in English language, targeting the West in general, this will necessarily almost automatically have influence on the Canadian audiences. This is something that is impossible to stop, this influence that goes from one audience to another. And also on climate change, and as my colleague said, also on LGBTQI issues, and et cetera, and immigration. So although Canada may not be the primary target, still the information operations produced and targeting Western audiences will also target other Western nations, including Canada.
Thank you. On y va maintenant à Madame.
Over to Ms. Michaud. You have 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. And thank you to the witnesses for being here. Your testimony is very enlightening, but also really worrisome. Mr. Chikoskovs, you mentioned earlier in your testimony that Russia was waging a political war against the West and has been for many years, and that this has intensified since 2022 and since the invasion of Ukraine. And one of the main targets is Canada, given its support for Ukraine. I get the impression that we're losing that political war, specifically these days. You mentioned some narratives that are part of the Russian propaganda in Canada, saying, for instance, that Ukraine is corrupt. And I was in Dublin last week because I was part of a meeting of the European organization in charge of safety there on the European territory. And the president of the Canadian delegation said, you should know that if we have information saying that the monies provided by Canada to Ukraine is not used to for the purposes for which it's intended, you have to understand that Canada's support for Ukraine, funding for Ukraine, will be ended. And he said so, saying, well, there's corruption everywhere. There's some in Canada. There's some everywhere. There seems to be some in Ukraine, but you have to ensure that any support provided by Canada for Ukraine will really be provided for the right reasons. So I feel that Russian propaganda is making its way all the way to Canadian officials, elected individuals and senators. So I wonder, how do we get back to the truth? How do we ensure that we understand what's fake information that has come all the way to the Canadian Parliament? So I was surprised to hear that question, because generally speaking, we have conversations on any support provided by Canada for Ukraine. What can we do to support them even more? And I felt that in this case, we were almost taking issue with the way the money was being spent by Ukraine. So I'd like to see what you have to say regarding that.
Thank you very much for this question. Mr. Chair, as far as I understand, for many cases, or for the overwhelming majority of the cases of Western support for Ukraine, there are audit committees, there are commissions that regularly check how resources, including financial resources, provided to Ukraine are spent. So there is a constant auditing process of this. And I think for maybe for those who are interested, it would be probably useful if they have access to those auditing operations, probably not, of course, concerning some secret information that could be too sensitive, but for general observations and general assessment of the how money is spent, for example. So strategic communication with those actors who are interested, I think this is important. Another thing is, of course, the social networks, and of course, in market economies, it's very difficult probably to have any control over social networks. I do think that authorities should talk to representatives of social networks and to have a closer cooperation in terms of monitoring and removing all those accounts that are spreading malign disinformation that can actually influence lives and health of millions of people, not necessarily in Ukraine only. So a better cooperation with social networks, I think this is important in short term, and in mid-term and long-term, media literacy and similar educational efforts are important to teach people in our age of misinformation, disinformation, and honestly, a huge amount of information that a regular person cannot consume without being confused about that amount of information. So this is important, to teach people how to double check information, how to rely on particular sources of information, and be able to distinguish truth from the lies.
Je vous remercie. Il me reste que
Thank you. I only have a few seconds left, and I wanted to ask something of Mr. Scott. You said that you uncovered everything under Tenet Media. In fact, we discovered that some individuals were in Canada and so on and so forth. Now, does CSIS or the RCMP or our intelligence services, should they have had would they have had the tools to uncover the same information? Because it seems that the company was based in Canada, but it's the FBI that uncovered the information. So do we have the same tools as the U.S.? And I know that you both mentioned the fact that the U.S. are indeed a larger target, the main target in North America, and Canada to a lesser degree. But would we have had the tools in Canada to uncover that type of issue? Unfortunately, your time is up, but perhaps we can hear a very short answer.
Short answer is yes. I believe the Canadian authorities do have those tools, and it's a question of where to look and how deeply and how to prioritize law enforcement and intelligence investigations.
Merci. We go now to Mr. McGregor. Mr. McGregor, go ahead, please, 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I want to echo colleagues in thanking our witnesses for helping guide us through. You know, I consider myself an optimist, but it's certainly hard not to be pessimistic when you look at the challenges that we're facing from this very real problem in our democratic space and in how our politics operate. And, you know, in the 9 years I've been an elected official, I have certainly seen the trend line getting much, much worse. Mr. Scott, I'd like to start with you because I know your organization is trying to find a way to support, quote, the realignment of digital media markets with democratic values. And, you know, your opening statement when you were talking about the number of impressions that were made, the subscriber base, the 1.1 billion video views of Tenet Media, you know, I'm thinking of this concept of like the public square and how that has transitioned over time. And, you know, we have to be very careful as policymakers because we don't want to give the Canadian public the perception that we're stepping in a hard way. But I think one thing we have to remember is that social media platforms, which have kind of become today's public square, are in fact not public. They are owned by a handful of billionaires. And they are designed for one purpose only, and that is to return a massive profit to those billionaires. And they wield an incredible amount of power. So, you know, I guess, Mr. Scott, like this is probably a very big question, but, you know, for policymakers, like how do we rein that power back in so that a handful of billionaires are not controlling our public discourse, but doing so in a way that is trying to protect freedom of speech? It seems like a monumental task, but this is not the first time this committee has been confronted with such a massive question. We looked at this issue 2 years ago when we were looking at Canada's security posture vis-a-vis Russia. And I'm not sure we've arrived at any answers yet. So I would love to have some of your feedback to help guide us through this particular study, because ultimately we want to make some solid recommendations to the Government of Canada.
I think you're exactly right to put your finger on the business model and the responsibilities of the industry to do a better job of protecting security and public safety. The exploitation of these products is not an accident. It is taking advantage of vulnerabilities that these giant, extremely wealthy companies have left in their services. So, and I want to state up front, the solutions that I would propose to you are almost never delete content. Okay, if you have an operator who is clearly being paid by a foreign adversary to intentionally manipulate and deceive the Canadian public, that's an illegal activity. It would be illegal in any media, just like it is on social media. That's prosecutable. That should be removed. But the key point here is that it's not the public square. It's not a mirror of society that you see when you open your phone and you look at Twitter or Facebook. It's a funhouse mirror. It's distortion. And it's like in a public sphere brings to mind the idea that everybody has an equal opportunity to speak. But in social media, that's not the case. TikTok and YouTube give megaphones to some speakers on their platforms and not to others. And they give the megaphones to the people who attract the most eyeballs and earn them the most money. So when you give megaphones to propagandists who are paid by the Russians, like at Tenet Media, you are giving them a massive advantage in communicating in that public sphere, and drowning out lots of other voices that might otherwise have been finding audiences in the Canadian public. So I think that there are things that can be done around transparency. How do these algorithms work? How does TikTok and YouTube decide what gets amplified and what doesn't? Why aren't these things more transparent to researchers and to public interest organizations? You know, we kind of look at these social media platforms like they're great innovators and magical technologists, when in reality, they're just making money like any other business. You know, if you thought back to the Cold War and it was 1985 and commercial broadcasters in Canada were handing an hour a day to the Kremlin to program whatever they wanted with no questions asked and blasting it out to the whole Canadian public, they'd be sat in front of this committee in 5 seconds. And yet with social media companies, you're like, well, there's nothing we can do. Well, there sure is a lot we can do about it. And it starts with conversations like this one.
Much for that. Professor Shekhovtsov, I'd like to turn to you. Being, of course, in Europe, you are much closer to the front lines of the confrontation between Russia and Ukraine. And certainly we are no strangers to, people emailing us about, how Canada is doing too much for Ukraine, that it's corrupt, that it's full of Nazis. We've all heard that false discourse. But I guess, what I'd like you to point out is, what would the consequences be for a country like Canada if we were not to hold Russia back in Ukraine, if we were to let them roll over that country? What does that do for the general security of NATO and countries like Canada?
Thank you for this question. It is my belief that Ukraine, although it is currently a main object of the Russian aggression, is not the last in line if Russia succeeds. And it only takes one Ukraine, one country, for Russia to amass a huge forces on the borders of the EU and NATO. And this completely changes the security situation in entire Europe. And the assistance that Western nations, including Canada, and again, I'm grateful for this support, they give to Ukraine. This is not only to Ukraine. This is an investment in the security or in maintaining the security architecture in entire Europe. And of course, if I know that Polish colleagues and colleagues in the Baltic states are always nervous about whether NATO would come to their help in case Russia decides to aggress them as well. But Ukraine is indeed, the Ukraine standing right now, it prevents Russia from attacking NATO member states, from attacking the EU, where the involvement of countries such as Canada would have been much, much, more significant, and the amounts of money and financial assistance to European...
I'm sorry, sir, I have to cut you off. Thank you very much. We'll start our second round now with Ms. Dancho. Ms. Dancho, go ahead. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for being here. Excellent testimony. I would like to build on some of the questions from Ms. Michaud concerning the capacity in Canada to... I have concerns that we relied on the DOJ to find this out, whereas you've mentioned we have the capacity in Canada, and yet it seemed from what you were saying that it hasn't been made a priority by our current intelligence and law enforcement agencies. And I did want to ask you a question about that. But before I get to that, I did want to address something with you, Mr. Chair, and register my disappointment that you canceled Thursday's meeting on this study. I do not feel that we were adequately consulted. The standard practice from my last experience with this before I was away on mat leave was that there was much more consultation with vice chairs, and as first vice chair, I do very much we anticipated that we would be called, discussed of what could be done about Thursday in the event witnesses were not able to attend Thursday committee meeting. Now, that does happen. However, in reviewing the motion put forward by the Liberals, the witnesses mentioned on there was not exhaustive. it specifically mentions another disinformation expert. And I know in past experience, we have had situations where our excellent public servants have come with relatively short notice to provide feedback and information. And of course, this area of study that we're working on has an intelligence focus, it has a law enforcement focus, it has a legal focus. So I would be shocked if all of the individuals in our public service, if any of them could not have come. I do believe that if more effort was put in, we could have had a robust meeting with other witnesses, perhaps within the own government apparatus, which we should include in this study. So I wanted to register my disappointment in that regard, given that we do not feel adequate consultation was provided. I would ask that in the future you provide better consultation. And the second point I wanted to make about this was we have a number of other things as a committee that if we can't get witnesses on this important study, we could have, for example, reviewed the Paul Bernardo report that has been gathering dust. The analysts worked very hard on that report. That was an area of intense public interest when this committee was reviewing it, given that the individual we were talking about was the worst mass killer and rapist in Canadian history, being moved from maximum security prison to medium security prison and all the privileges that entails. I was shocked to see that we wouldn't at least look at that draft report. The committee had already approved to study that issue. We had the draft report. It's sitting and collecting dust. Why is it we were not able to review that report on Thursday? There are a number of studies that we have agreed to as a committee, a number of things we could have talked about. I think it would be shocking to the public to think that a meeting of the Public Safety and National Security Committee should be canceled because we have nothing to look into. I just find that completely unacceptable, Mr. Chair. And again, in the Liberals' own words, Ms. O'Connell, I wish to discuss this with her, but she's not here at the moment. She did mention that, and I quote her, "We as a committee should be held accountable if we don't take this as a very serious priority. We owe it to Ukrainians to not wait another minute." And yet, where was the discussion, where was the leadership from Liberal members to ensure we had a committee meeting on this on Thursday? There was no one that could, but I find it very hard to believe that, Mr. Chair. So I'd ask that more effort be put into ensuring we have this study. If we can't find witnesses, find someone from government. It is important that we get into this issue. But if we can't, let's focus on the work we've already done. And I would ask if there's no one we can find for a very study, let's look at the Paul Bernardo study. So I wanted to register my very clear disappointment that it was not adequately consulted and that the Public Safety and National Security Committee of Canada failed to have a meeting for an excuse that I don't find acceptable. There are a whole host of issues we could be looking into, and it is a failure that we had that meeting canceled, Mr. Chair. Thank you. With my remaining minute, just on my question, Mr. Scott, again, can you elaborate a little bit on just what you'd said to Ms. Michaud? I thought it was a great area of interest that this committee should hear. I can reiterate if you don't recall what I said.
Certainly, yeah. I do. I don't have any information about what the Canadian authorities did or didn't do or what their involvement might have been in the DOJ indictment. I'm only relying on publicly available documents, including the DOJ's published affidavits. In my experience working in the U.S. government, it is very possible, if not likely, that there was Five Eyes cooperation if this was an intelligence operation that discovered this Russian intervention through signals intelligence. So just because it's not public that the Canadian authorities were involved doesn't mean they weren't. So I can't say one way or the other whether or not they had an involvement in this particular case. What I will say is it's very difficult to detect this kind of operation of payola influence using dark money as a foreign power because there are so many different YouTube and TikTok channels out there that will operate on a pay-for-play basis. And that, as I read the DOJ affidavits, it was only through wiretaps that they were able to discover this one. And partly I put that at the feet of the technology companies who simply don't monitor sufficiently for patterns of propagation characteristics that indicate the probability of some kind of malign influence or coordinated inauthentic activity.
Thank you, sir. We go now to Mr. McDonald, please, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, I just wanted to go back a little bit to Mr. McGregor, talked a little bit about it, but it was also mentioned in the preamble, and it was regarding the operations launched at European countries how they differ from operations launched to Canada and the United States. So we did mention France and Germany, and I'm just wondering What is the difference there between what they're doing now to Canada and basically what they've been doing for a number of years to France and Germany? And to Mr. Jacques, please.
Thank you. Thank you for this question. Indeed, some of the Russian information operations, they target particular audiences. And although there can be the Western world can be one audience, there are still differences between different nations. And those differences, to put it probably simpler, is that every society has its own vulnerabilities and sensitivities. And the vulnerabilities that are probably inherent in one Western society is not really a case for another. Just to give you an example, for France and for Germany, the immigration or even illegal immigration from the Middle East, from Africa, is something that these countries are concerned with. And this is probably not the case for Central and European countries, where immigration from those regions of the world is not that significant. For Canada, I think this is the proximity to the US. Maybe some Canadians are not very happy to be, even confused sometimes with the citizens of the United States. This Nazi problem is also of a concern. I am aware that in many debates in Canada,
Move on. Are both far and right political actors equally susceptible, or are they focusing on one over the other?
I think if we are talking about Canada, these are mostly left-wing, mostly far-left actors that are susceptible to Russian disinformation campaigns regarding Ukraine, if we are talking about this. While if the Russian propagandists are talking about immigration, LGBT, then probably it's the far right, the Canadian far right, that is the most susceptible. So different topics, different audiences. Really, those strategic and tactical narratives, they are tailor-made to divide nations, to divide the national consensus. So they're using these extremes from the right and left in order to achieve their objectives.
Can you see around the world that particular political parties are using this propaganda as a decisive tool in their own countries?
We see that in some countries of the EU, and I would probably mention Hungary and Slovakia at the moment, where these countries have governments that are particularly influenced by Russian malign strategic and tactical narratives. And the fact, for example, that Slovakia is no longer providing state-sponsored support in the military sphere to Ukraine, in my opinion, this is quite largely an influence or effect of Russian disinformation being very, very successful.
Opinion basically in the United States, if one government gets in over the other right now, there will be a decrease in support for Ukraine. We've seen a government opposition here vote against a free trade agreement with Ukraine. Are these the types of things that concern you?
I am concerned, of course, about the continuing support for Ukraine. For Ukraine, I'm sure it doesn't really matter where the support is coming from. And as I mentioned in the very beginning, all parties, all political forces that in one way or another provide support for Ukraine, provide assistance, they're all welcomed by Ukrainians who are fighting this existential fight.
Seconds.
That's fine, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. So we'll start our second round. Sorry, we're in our second round. Wake me up. Avec Madame Michaud. Allez-y, s'il vous plaît, 2 minutes et demi.
Go ahead. You have 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. I'm not sure if you've heard of this controversy, quite recent, in fact, in Canada, and my question is for both of you, and you can answer in turn. There was a presentation, the desire to show Russians at war. It was a documentary, a Russian documentary by a Russian filmmaker, Anastasia Tropimova. She's Canadian-Russian. And some people said, well, no, it's Russian propaganda. It was illegally filmed in occupied territories in Ukraine. Other people say, no, it was funded by France and Canada. Canada, in fact, provided a couple of $100,000 to the filmmaker. So how can we distinguish the various forms of propaganda that we can see here in Canada? And I'm not claiming that this film is in fact propaganda, but there was some controversy. Our own public officials, including Chrystia Freeland, our Deputy Prime Minister, said that she was uncomfortable. And I'm not sure if you heard echoes. There were people here from the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress that were uncomfortable with the film. So this is something that is in the media. Do we make room for it? Is it in fact a form of propaganda? How should we try and distinguish all of those things according to you? I'll start with you, Mr. Scott.
Thank you for your question. I'm unfamiliar with the film, so I can only speak broadly and say there has always been and will always be in democratic societies speech that makes people uncomfortable. The question, first and foremost, is it lawful? And there is a very high bar in Canada for what constitutes illegal speech. And if it reaches or exceeds that bar, then it shouldn't be permitted. Everything else, I think, is fair game. However, that doesn't mean that broadcasters or social media platforms have to amplify it and extend its audience for commercial reasons beyond that which it would achieve on its own merits.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you.
Now to Mr. McGregor, 2 minutes and a half, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll turn to Mr. Scott again. And I kind of wanted to just look at like how we assign responsibility for where we're at. I mean, in my opening exchange with you, I talked about, how we have a handful of billionaires who control and wield so much power and influence over the public discourse through their platforms. And we're certainly looking forward to hearing from a few of the representatives. But, the influencers themselves, these are not regular everyday folks. They are multimillionaires in some cases, and they make a lot of money doing what they do. Do you think the influencers themselves need to be assigned some responsibility for this, or can they remain willfully ignorant of where they're receiving their money? Do we need to target the social media platforms? One of my NDP colleagues has an idea for legislation that tries to enforce algorithmic transparency. Do we need to look at large corporate sponsors whose ads run on these platforms and are, being funneled towards eyeballs depending on how extreme the content is? Or is it a mix of all three? Love to hear your feedback on that.
Yes, you should do all of those things. And I'll echo the comments at the top of the hearing that the individuals involved in the Tenet Media case that are Canadian citizens, they ought to be before this panel. I would also say representatives of the technology companies, in particular Google, who owns YouTube, TikTok, Meta, Twitter, they also should be sat before this committee answering questions about what they do and don't do to guard against foreign interference operations. The vulnerabilities that these companies permit on their products is really unacceptable. And they do so because we allow them to do so as citizens and as communities with the power to make laws and determine how businesses do and don't make money. And the longer we allow them to do this without accountability and with impunity, the more we send the message that this is a completely acceptable practice and they can offload all of the harms of security and safety vulnerabilities onto the public.
I'll leave it there, Chair.
6 seconds. Thank you. So then we'll wrap up this panel. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you to the witnesses for your testimony. and for appearing today, and your information is most helpful. So this concludes this portion of the meeting. We will suspend for a few minutes and change panels. Thank you. We are short one witness at this point. Hopefully, if that witness arrives online in the interim, we will pause briefly and test their audio. So I would like to welcome our witness for the second hour. We have from the Center for International Governance Innovation, we have Mr. Wesley Wark, Senior Fellow. Thank you for joining us today. So I now invite Mr. Wark to make an opening statement of up to 5 minutes. Please go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm grateful to appear before the committee on this important study. There are two concerning aspects of Russian disinformation targeting Canada. One is real, the effort to manipulate Canadian attitudes towards the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The other is what I would call a potentiality, the use of Russian intelligence and cyber capabilities, which are significant, to interfere in Canadian elections and democratic processes in the future. These elements are captured in a CSIS intelligence assessment of May 2023, which was recently released to PIFI. The conclusion to the CSIS assessment reads, and I'll just quote very briefly, while the Russian diaspora and its organizations might not have a broad impact on Canadian society, their influence becomes more apparent when consolidated with other organizations and their online presence, pro-Russian proxies or agents of influence, and the Russian Federation's global disinformation efforts. There is also, of course, the blowback potential of Russian disinformation operations targeting other countries, especially the United States. The question I want to address concerns Canadian governmental capabilities to detect and counter Russian-directed online information operations. First, on detection. It involves, of course, attribution of attacks back to a Russian state or proxy source, the tracing of methodologies of attack, especially technical ones, and an understanding of intended targets. Canadian capabilities for detection of malicious online information operations are nascent and have been created in an evolving and reactive way. This is the history of the Rapid Response Mechanism, RRM Canada, in a nutshell. And I'll just very briefly go over that history. The RRM, as I'll call it, was created following the 2018 G7 meeting to perform a coordination function to respond to a variety of shared threats to democracy. It was only after the Russian invasion of Ukraine that the Prime Minister announced in August 2022 the establishment of a dedicated unit within RRM Canada Global Affairs to address Russian and other state-sponsored disinformation. In essence, RRM Canada's disinformation unit is brand spanking new. Its resources are minuscule. Its capacity to engage with a range of expert private sector media monitoring and open source intelligence organizations is very limited. It was an innovative idea and it has potential, but its engine room, as I would call it, is far too small, and its fit as a Global Affairs Canada unit within the broader security and intelligence community is very problematic. Our detection side is weak. What about countering? There are various tools, and I'll just list them: engaging with foreign state actors directly, working with allies, an important one, naming and shaming campaigns, as they're sometimes called, helping strengthen the resilience of targeted communities, not least by giving them the means to be the eyes and ears against disinformation, providing broader public education through published threat assessments from organizations like CSIS and CSE, and at the pointy end, two things: using CSE powers to what it could be called colloquially hack back. This is in essence using CSE powers provided to them in 2019 for offensive cyber operations, and then criminal sanctions, which should be boosted by some of the provisions in Bill C-70. No one tool will suffice, all are necessary. What about the Foreign Influence Transparency Registry, newly established in Bill C-70? Here, I would urge the committee to have realistic expectations. FITR, as its acronym goes, will be mostly a registry for good guys. It won't stop covert bad actors, but it might have a deterrent effect for gray zone activities, and it might open up a criminal sanctions path, such as the one that was utilized in the recent United States Department of Justice indictment against two Russia Today actors. What do we need? First, I would argue we need upgrades to RRM Canada's capacity and changes to its placement in government. One suggestion would be to move it to Public Safety's Office for Countering Foreign Interference. It's just in the wrong place at Global Affairs. We also need, and this is critical to any understanding of foreign malign influence operations, we need a much stronger open source intelligence capability in the Canadian S&I community. There is some capability. The function is far too widely distributed within the S&I community and subject to too many diverse mandates and sets of authorities. And we saw some of this at work with regard to the government's efforts to respond to the Freedom Convoy protests. A central OSINT, open source intelligence agency with a clear mandate is needed. Finally, I would encourage the committee to give some serious thought to creating an equivalent of Sweden's Psychological Defense Agency, which was established by Sweden in January 2022. This agency combines an operations role in detecting and countering foreign malign influence operations, especially over social media, as well as a public role to strengthen societal resilience. A psychological defense agency may sound a little Orwellian, but that's the world we live in.
Can I get you to wrap up, sir? You're good? Thank you. So our other witness, Mr. Oksanen, has now been able to join us online. We will pause briefly and do an audio check. Suspended. Mr. Oksanen. So we are now joined by Mr. Patrick Oksanen as an individual who is, Mr. Oksanen is resident senior fellow, Stockholm Free World Forum, and he's joining us, of course, by video conference. Mr. Oksanen, if you would please go ahead with your opening statement of up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, sir. And dear madams and sirs, I'm very honored to be invited to the committee to give a statement on Russian influence in allied countries. I will focus my time on transnational repression, targeting people from the Nordic countries within an EU and NATO country, people that have been exposing Russian influence work, and among them journalists, researchers, and civil servants. My personal experience started in 2015 when I wrote about Russian information warfare as an opinion writer for a green liberal centrist regional Swedish newspaper. Since then, I have received phone calls with demands that I should stop writing because I'm about to cause a nuclear war. I have regularly been accused of being a racist, mentally sick, being a very despicable person, and received several death threats online, been physically intimidated in public place by the pro-Russian Nazi Nordic resistance movement. By the way, they are classified in the US as a terror group. I have been smeared, wrongly accused of being a convicted pedophile in a Facebook group very close to the Russian embassy in Sweden. A campaign in which an alternative media editor-in-chief took part. He was also prohibited to enter the Swedish parliament due to contacts with Russian intelligence. And since he repeated it and given large reach, to the extent that I also been harassed in person with this accusation outside my part-time workplace at the Swedish Defense University in Stockholm. And that was from a student at the university who has a background in the alternative right movement. These are just some brief examples what have happened during a decade and still are happening. And of course, that has had consequences for me and my family, as we are living now with our addresses and public registers protected in Sweden. But here is the clue. I'm not the story. I'm just here as an example of the story. The story is how Russia tries to scare those who are exposing Kremlin operations to the public. If we widen the scope, some more things that we know have happened to Nordic citizens in EU, NATO country, citizens that work as journalists, experts, or public servants. Here we have cases of home visits with leaving traces in your home so that you can see that someone has been there, like leaving, well, number 2, unflushed in the toilet. Just feel the stress and insecurity that means if you imagine that happening in your home. Cyber attacks against individuals, infiltration of workplaces with insider giving Russian operatives data on a person's travel and whereabouts, name list demonstrations, and also mass reporting to media or researcher ethic boards targeting an individual person. Digital and physical harassment up to the level of demonstration of the capability to kill someone, such as a drive-by shooting with a water gun in a Central European capital. All these methods have resulted in self-censorships and delayed understandings of the threat. One public example is that Swedish political scientists didn't dare to sign a public debate article in a Swedish paper in support of one of their targeted colleagues, being afraid that they should receive similar treatment. The aim of these methods is to paralyze or to fragment a hostile person. This is how the East German Stasi defined these methods back in the 1980s. It has long, real-term effects on the targets, like stress-related diseases, mental strain, and also lack of understanding from the surrounding, like workplaces and the public sphere. It's a long time that Russia threw out the rule book, and we are now heading to a more critical situation in relation to Russia. The year ahead and the years ahead to come, Russia will deploy any means below Article 5 to frighten and to split our societies so Russia can achieve her imperial goals. These are threats to peace, stability, and national security, both in the Nordic countries and to Canada. Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you, sir, for your statement. The clerk has asked me to remind you that should you need translation services, if you look on your Zoom window, there's a button on the bottom somewhere near the center that allows you to choose between English, French, or original feeds. So please advise if you have any difficulties. We will start our questioning now with Mr. Lloyd. Mr. Lloyd, go ahead, please. 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Very informative panel. Mr. Wark or Dr. Wark? Mr. Wark, do you think that any foreign interference campaign, whether it be from China, Iran, Russia, or any other foreign state actor, hostile foreign state actor, is it more effective for them to basically create false campaigns out of nowhere, or is it that they generally latch on to existing societal issues to amplify their campaigns?
Thank you, Mr. Lloyd. It's an excellent question. I think the general view that emerges from studies of propaganda offensives over decades, if not centuries, is that they are typically most effective when they are able to latch on to existing views, even if they're very minority views, and try to amplify them and find new audiences for them and spread them. So I think it's relatively rare that a disinformation operation from a foreign authoritarian state would try to create some brand new narrative. They depend for their success on kind of latching on to what they understand to be societal dynamics in foreign states. But I would just say, finally, with regard to this is potentially a weakness for authoritarian foreign states because it requires a fairly sophisticated understanding of the state that they're targeting.
Yes, and so I guess, my question kind of leads into like these concerns that Canadians have right now regarding inflation, housing, crime. Like these aren't issues that are being made up by foreign state powers. They might be being amplified by them, but there aren't issues that are being made up by foreign powers. These are real issues that Canadians are facing. Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely, and of course, disinformation campaigns love as well to latch on to various kinds of conspiracy theories that might link to some of those significant societal issues.
Thank you for that. It's interesting, at our previous panel that we had last Tuesday, I was very concerned, the witnesses talking about the high level of infiltration in Canada's media and academics in particular. I learned about the existence of a group called the Valdai Institute, or the Valdai Club. Can you comment on, the role of Russian misinformation, disinformation campaigns on influencers in academia and media?
I may be the wrong person to give you an absolutely objective view of this coming out of that academic community, but I would say that the impact within the academic world is probably pretty limited. If you take the example of the Valdai Club, I cannot imagine that there are many Canadian academics who would fully subscribe to their activities in the present day. The Valdai Club has kind of evolved over time. It is certainly something much more sinister and propaganda-oriented than it was when it was first established. So I don't think there's a large traction in the academic community. I also doubt that that's really a significant target for Russian disinformation operations. And I think the CSIS intelligence assessment is interesting in that regard because it really is suggesting that what Russia would like to be able to do as a foreign state actor in disinformation is kind of latch on to a Russian diaspora in Canada and try and use elements of that diaspora to spread the message further. But there are significant limitations in their ability to do that.
Interesting. Now, you talked about the weaknesses of the government's actions. You're talking about the minuscule investment at Global Affairs Canada. Can you elaborate further on that? And why do you believe there's been such a minuscule investment? And what do you think needs to actually be done in order to deter this Russian misinformation and other foreign actors for that matter?
So an excellent question, and probably government officials are better placed to explain, how this attention has evolved. But I'm confident in my appraisal that it is minusculely resourced at RRM Canada. The best available figures are there between 6 and 8 officials assigned to that unit at Global Affairs. And there is also, in addition to the human talent question, the technological capacities that you need, sophisticated ones, to be able to sift through an immense universe of social media and other internet activity to come up with indications of disinformation campaigns. This is why I think the general understanding is that no government, no matter how well it might resource a unit like RRM Canada, is able to do that on its own. It has to be able to engage in partnerships, extensive ones, with established social media monitoring companies, with established private sector open source intelligence organizations. And this is something that, frankly, the Canadian government is very bad at doing, creating those partnerships.
Based on the comments you just made, the minuscule investment, do you think that this government's not taking this issue as seriously as they should be?
I think they have come to take it seriously, partly under pressure of the events. I think attitudes shifted with regard to the seriousness of Russian disinformation after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, although Russia's been a problematic actor in international affairs for a long time. Similarly, I think attitudes profoundly shifted with regard to understanding China's engagement with the world in the context of the Two Michaels case. So there have been shifts, but they have been recent ones and perhaps delayed.
Would you say our current government was taken by surprise by this development?
Thanks. If witnesses can answer quickly.
By surprise. Thank you for this opportunity. Yes, I think that's fair to say. I think that the scale of both Russian and Chinese aggressive operations targeting democracies in the West, not just Canada, and targeting them across a range of, using a range of tools, not least espionage tools, cyber attack tools. The extent of that aggression did certainly take the Canadian government by surprise.
Thank you. We go now to Mr. Erskine Smith for 6 minutes.
Thanks very much, Chair. Professor Warwick, it's good to see you again. I want to start with picking up on a thread that Mr. Lloyd left off with in terms of disinformation and propaganda, taking issues that already exist and then amplifying them to sow distrust and social disorder. And, you look at the Tenet Media case as an example, and there are stories focused on Canada where inflation in Canada is insane. Okay, That sounds like it could have come from any quarter in sort of a more conservative network. But then they've got Canada has fallen. Okay, fallen, broken. We've heard that refrain a little bit before. Canada is becoming a communist hellhole. And then the Great Replacement. Can we finally talk about it? And there's a pattern where it might start with something that is within the realm of ordinary discourse, and we get to a place that is incredibly sinister. And can you speak to that element of propaganda, specifically Russian propaganda in this case, but propaganda overall?
Thank you, Mr. Erskine-Smith. I think the potential is clearly there. I think that we would need to consider it in a kind of proportional sense in terms of real impacts in Canada and real understandings, again, on the part of foreign states, devising these campaigns about the nature of the society that they're trying to, alter perceptions within. I think those are two great limitations. But I would say, just for example, with regard to what we know of Tenet Media's operations, one of its key influencers that it hired and spent a lot of money on was a figure who turned up with attached, allegedly heroic significance during the Freedom Convoy protests and the occupation in Ottawa. So that may be a small indication of some of the dangers that can attach to.
Well, let's stay with that, Mr. Wark, because Mr. Scott, who was just here, suggested that the accounts that were subsidized by Tenet Media ultimately accrued 16 million followers and had that initial reach. But then in Tenet Media channels, in 1 year, just on Twitter alone, they had 20 billion impressions and an additional 1.1 billion video views on other platforms like YouTube and Rumble. Now, in the words of Mr. Scott, he's right. That's extraordinary value for $10 million. Absolutely extraordinary value. You mentioned the Freedom Convoy, though. I mean, there's a clear case where there was a destabilizing conversation in our debate, certainly. And yeah, sure, some conservatives were tripping over themselves to deliver coffee and donuts. But the fact of the matter is, there were many far-right accounts in the convoy crowd that were retweeting and amplifying RT content, Russian content. What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, this is how social media campaigns can attempt to be effective. And I think for many of us who would not spend time on Tenet Media channels, it is a head shaker as the extent to which they are able to spread their message through this network. And I would note, and it's a component of the indictment, as Mr. Erskine-Smith probably knows, that Tenet Media was not able to show that kind of commercial value to justify the Russian investment in it. I think there is an important difference to be. Sorry to cut you off,
Mr. Wark, but you mentioned the indictment, and I just want to get to that because I only got a minute and a half left. And in the indictment, and Mr. Scott was talking about solutions, and I want to get there because when it comes to solutions, obviously when it comes to Canadians amplifying content, but in good faith, as much as it might be misguided, in good faith, or in the case of Russians amplifying homegrown Canadian content, the path to enforcement isn't as clear to me. I mean, especially, free speech matters. We've got to protect free speech. But when it comes to the case of, in that specific indictment, where you've got the Founder 1 and Founder 2 that clearly know that these are Russians that are funding their operation here. And it might be, I don't know about the actual producers of content. Maybe they don't know, right? They say they don't know. But Founder 1 and Founder 2 knew what was going on based upon the information in that indictment. Do we have enough? Is the law clear enough to ensure that there's going to be action as against Founder 1 and Founder 2? Because they're not charged yet. But is the law clear enough that there's a path for that?
Mr. Erskine-Smith, it's a great question, and I think much will depend on how the Foreign Influence Transparency Registry is rolled out. We have the legislation. We don't have the registry yet. The registry would have the capacity to do two things if it is effectively instituted. One would be to provide some degree of deterrence against so-called gray zone actors, which you might consider Tenet Media founders illustrative of. The other would be to pursue either monetary or criminal sanctions under either that legislation or changes to the criminal code that were introduced, particularly changes to the Security of Information Act that were introduced in Bill C-70. So hypothetically, in future, we might have a better capacity, as the United States has had for some time, to use criminal sanctions against such activities. At the moment, we don't really have that.
Thanks very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. On y va maintenant à Madame Michaud. Allez-y, s'il vous plaît, 6 minutes.
Monsieur le Président.
You have 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. And I'll stay in the same vein as my colleague with Mr. Wark. You talked about C70 adopted recently to face foreign interference. I was wondering if the witnesses felt that Canada has the same tools as the Americans have, for instance, with the FBI, to uncover schemes such as the ones behind Tenet Media. So I'd like your opinion with respect to that. Does Canada, according to you, does Canada have the same tools, the right legislative tools as well, in the context that we're experiencing now with rapid technological advances? Of course, social media are falling prey to all sorts of disinformation. So do we have the sufficient tools that we need with C70? And I suspect we'll need to constantly stay ahead of new schemes used by nefarious actors.
Thank you, Madame Michaud. I'll respond in English. I would just say that in terms of tools, this is partly why I think the first tool is the ability to detect these kinds of activities, the serious ones. And that goes to the intelligence capacity. It goes to the disinformation monitoring capacity, which I think is too weak at the moment in Canada. And that was the burden of some of my remarks in the opening presentation. In terms of responding, if you can detect, responding to them, I think the toolkit has been very limited up until recently. I think Bill C-70 will improve things. Bill C-59, previous to that, in terms of new powers given to CSE, may improve our capacities to respond to these disinformation campaigns and try to render them null and void. But I think the last thing that has to be said is that in no real universe will we be able to detect or counter all such disinformation campaigns. And at the end of the day, it comes down to Canadian citizens and consumers to be able to respond themselves in a sensible way to them.
À votre avis,
So in your opinion, what can we draw from the U.S.'s experience? They seem to be more advanced. They are the main target of Russian propaganda in North America. Are there certain things that we can draw inspiration from in terms of what's done there? Could we find a way of improving here in Canada? I agree with you that we'll likely never be at the same level, or we'll probably never be able to detect everything. But are there examples across the planet that you've seen? For instance, we've heard witnesses say that France and Germany seem to be the main targets in Europe. Perhaps they've now produced things that we could use here in Canada.
Thank you, Madame Michaud. To just say very briefly, and I don't mean this in a supercilious way, the United States has the FBI and we do not. We have the RCMP, which has divided attention in terms of contract and policing roles, national security roles, and as the National Security Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians recently pointed out, that division of responsibilities is not serving Canadians well. Something has to be done seriously to boost the capacity of the RCMP to perform as a national security law enforcement agency, which has been in its mandate for decades and was reinforced, frankly, once CSIS was created. So we have a big problem on the law enforcement side. The legislative side, I think we are improving on. But again, I would come back to the fact that we need, the starting point for all of this has to be an intelligence capacity, which we don't have at the moment.
Puis dans votre allocution d'ouverture, vous avez parlé de...
And in your opening remarks, you talked about something under global affairs, the rapid response mechanism. Could you give us a bit more information on the rapid response mechanism?
Thank you, Madam Michaud. I would just say, as I tried to explain in the brief history, the Rapid Response Mechanism was originally established as a kind of secretariat to coordinate activities on the part of the G7 countries. And that was in 2018. It was only in 2022, late 2022, midway through the year, that on the basis of what we were seeing in terms of the kind of psychological operations that Russia was conducting in conjunction with its invasion of Ukraine, that the government decided that we needed a dedicated unit to kind of monitor disinformation. And so that was added on to RRM Canada in 2022. And it's important, of course, to note that Global Affairs Canada has no legislative specific authority to do this work. It relies on Crown prerogative to do it, which is, in the world of intelligence, always a weakness.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you.
McGregor, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to both witnesses for joining us today. Professor Wark, I'd like to start with you. I appreciate your opening remarks about the rapid response mechanism, and I guess it's in the name. It's a response. It's after the fact, and I'm always trying to look for more proactive ways that we can effectively deal with this issue. And you may have heard my earlier interventions with Mr. Scott from Reset Tech, and just lamenting the fact that so much of our public discourse today is held on platforms that are controlled by a handful of billionaires who, of course, their main motive is to enrich themselves. And we can see the way their social media platforms operate. I think Mr. Scott said, if we were back in the height of the Cold War in the mid-1980s and a number of Canadian media companies were running an hour's worth of Kremlin propaganda, they'd be hauled before a committee right away and action would be taken. So I guess, from your perspective, we've talked about, how we can confront the power that these social media companies wield. And I know it's difficult from a Canadian perspective because they're largely based in California and in Silicon Valley, and they are subject to U.S. laws. But doing nothing is not an answer, and we have already seen the corrosive effects that their platforms are having on what people in Canada are thinking about and the effect it's having on our democratic norms. So do you have any thoughts that you can share with the committee on maybe how we proactively deal with the platforms that are hosting a lot of this misinformation and disinformation, in some ways directly linked to what Russia is trying to do with its strategic objectives?
Thank you, Mr. McGregor. I wouldn't claim to be an expert on platform regulation. Many of the people I work with at the Center for International Governance Innovation, that's their Kool-Aid, and I'm sure they would be happy to come and talk to you about that at some point. I would just say, to come back to your question about rapid response mechanism, it's probably mistitled. I think the idea was it was going to be a rapid detection mechanism, but maybe that sounded a little too un-Canadian when it was created. I think, I would take to heart many of Mr. Scott's comments in terms of a guide, particularly in terms of requiring these social media platforms to be much more transparent and much more responsible. I would also add to that, and this maybe just reflect my own age, we did this to ourselves. No one required us to sign up to YouTube, Instagram, et cetera, and drink from those fountains. And I think Canadians have to exercise some degree of responsibility themselves in terms of how they intersect with social media platforms. And there's an education component to that. There may be a regulation component to it. But at the end of the day, in a democratic society, it comes down to us to be able to exercise good judgment in that regard. And I think there's a lot that can be done. And this is why I'm very keen on a model like the Swedish Psychological Defense Agency, which perhaps our other guest knows more about than I do, that could combine a detection capacity and use intelligence resources and so on alongside a public-facing organization that could really talk to and try and educate Canadians.
Thank you for that. Mr. Oksanen, maybe that's a great segue to you. So I'd like to maybe have your thoughts on the same question, because I think, with Canada's geographic position in the world, I think we have a history of feeling quite insulated from events that happen on the other side of the Atlantic. But of course, for residents in Sweden and of course your neighbor in Finland, Russia is always present. It always has been for centuries. And so I'm just wondering, how does that inform the discourse in Sweden on this very same topic? And any other lessons that you think Canadians need to learn from that we can make recommendations to our own government on?
I think both Finland and Sweden have had an advantage here because we are knowing Russia more than other countries. You mentioned earlier in this panel discussion that there are problems in Germany and France because they don't have the same kind of level of understanding of Russia. So we have a good understanding of the problem in general in society. And then we have as been mentioned, we have this new agency, the Agency for Psychological Defense. It has been up and running now for 2 years, and the effects are too early to tell really. But what we are seeing is that there is an increased level of awareness in society. They've been doing a lot of work in educating civil servants in various levels, and then also have this detection capability so that they could reach out to relevant agencies that have to deal with the actual problem and to address it in the Swedish system. The Psychological Defense Agency is not the one addressing disinformation if it is under, for example, public health, to take one example. But if I may address also the overall question on regulated platforms, I think we should start to have a debate and thinking about social media a bit like tobacco, because we have dealt with tobacco in a way to inform the public of the problems, the risks, and also, for example, for a younger person not being able to buy it and so on and so on. And I think that is an approach that we should consider in the open society. That debate is nowhere yet in the world, but I think that is something that we need to start to think about.
Thank you, Mr. McGregor. We'll start our second round now with Mr. Brock. Please go ahead, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and I'd like to thank both witnesses for your attendance and participation in this study. At this time, Mr. Chair, I'd like to move a motion that was put on notice last Friday and filed with the clerk in both official languages. Motion reads that the committee reports to the House the minister should apologize for defending a dirtbag cop shooter by saying, quote, "It is disturbing to me as a member of Parliament to hear other members of Parliament use names and slurs towards constituents. These are Canadians we are talking about. When we are calling each other names and calling constituents names, we can do better," end of quote. And recognize this monster is currently being charged with attempted murder, possession of a firearm, uttering death threats, and breaching a probation order, and has previously been charged with possessing a stolen vehicle, stolen license plates, breaking into and entering multiple homes, as well as breaching an earlier probation order. I'd like to be recognized as the first speaker, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Brock. I call the attention of the committee to the House of Commons Procedure and Practice, page 1065. Regarding the admissibility of motions to committee proceedings, a motion should not contain offensive or unparliamentary language. Motions should not contain any objectionable or irregular wording, and they should be neither argumentative nor in a style of speech, So on that basis, the chair finds that this motion is not admissible. The chair is challenged, so the decision for the committee is shall the decision of the chair be sustained. If you vote yes, then you agree with the chair. If you vote no, then the motion will go forward. Mr. Clerk, if you would take the roll.
Ms. Damoff.
Yes.
Mr. Gay.
Yes.
Mr. McDonald. Ms. Zaid.
Yes.
Mr. Erskine-Smith.
Yes.
Mr. Brock.
No.
Mr. Lloyd.
No.
Mr. Mutz.
No.
Mr. Shipley.
No.
Madame Michaud. Mr. McGregor. Yeas pour 7, nays contre 4, 4.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. The chair's decision is sustained. Mr. Bronk, you have 2 minutes left.
My time to my colleague, Mr. Motz.
Thank you. There. Thank you very much, Chair. And I would like to ask the Mr. Dr. Work a question, if I could. We had a witness here on Tuesday of last week that indicated that why is her question was, why is Canada still a safe haven for Russian operatives? And I'd like to ask you the same question. Why is Canada still such a safe haven? And why has the current government not taken any action with regard to those in Canada who collaborate with institutions that spread Russian propaganda?
Thank you, Mr. Mose, for the question. I perhaps could just preface my answer by saying that I wear as a badge of honor the fact that I'm on the Russian sanctions list. That is not our list of sanctioned individuals, but theirs. And partly I think I'm on that list because I have advocated for a much more aggressive activity on the part of the government of Canada in terms of declaring Russian diplomats who are engaging in activities that are not commensurate with their Geneva Convention duties to be declared persona non grata. As Mr. Motz probably knows, Canada is almost unique among NATO and EU countries in not having expelled a single Russian diplomat from their establishment in Canada since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I think there, frankly, is no good argument to be made for that lack of action. But I would distinguish that activity, which is fully within the federal government's capacity, from the broader question of dealing with Russian potential agents of influence and proxies and so on in Canada. And here, I think there is a twofold problem. One is that up until very recently in Bill C-70, we really haven't had the legal tools to respond to that problem. And secondly, I think there is, as I indicated in response to Madame Michaud's question, a genuine institutional lack of capacity, both on the intelligence side and the law enforcement side, to be able to respond to these threats.
Thank you, Mr. Motz. We go now to Mr. Gahir. Mr. Gahir, please go ahead. 6 minutes. Sorry, 5 minutes. I apologize.
Great. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing before the committee. Professor Work, my questions are for you. So you've mentioned this in the past as well to me, that we don't have an FBI in Canada, that we have the RCMP, and the RCMP up to 80% of the work that they do is contract policing. You've obviously thought about this at length. Can you talk a little bit about what that would look like if the RCMP looked a little bit more like the FBI? What would happen to contract policing, and then what could the RCMP then focus on that they don't quite have the resources for now, in your opinion?
So very briefly, Mr. McGarrett, it's a complicated issue. I think in the broad scheme of things, the RCMP should get out of the business of contract policing altogether. An alternative model would have to be found in terms of funding law enforcement, the provinces, territories, municipalities. But that is not beyond, surely, our ability. And I think what we need the RCMP to become is a nationally focused law enforcement and national security agency that can really have the capacity to dig into a variety of serious criminal and national security offenses, whether they're serious organized crime in nature or have to do with national security challenges, of which we face many.
Okay. We've talked a little bit about the specific tactics that are employed by Russia to manipulate Western voices. Do you want to expand on that a little bit? Are these efforts, do you think they're effective, especially in a country like Canada where we have some of the highest rates of tertiary education? And I want to ask a follow-up to that as well regarding, do you think there's an ethnic component to some of this destabilizing manipulation? Because Canada obviously has a large proportion of immigrants that perhaps English their first languages. does the level of Russian influence, does it go as deep as reaching into these other minority communities within Canada?
Again, thank you for the question. I would just say two things. I think Russia is in a slightly difficult position in terms of engaging in disinformation operations against Canada. And some of this was pointed out in the CSIS assessment, which I'd encourage members of the committee to read because I think it's a good overview document. Part of the problem is that there is not a lot of sympathy for Russian positions on issues in Canada across the board, particularly in the aftermath of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Also, that the Russian diaspora is not a unified entity within Canada. It contains many kind of diverse groups, including groups like the Russian-Canadian Democratic Alliance, which are very much in opposition to the Putin regime. So they don't have a big kind of diaspora base to work on, and they don't have sympathies that they can draw on. Against that is the fact that the Russians are past masters at disinformation or propaganda operations. They devote a lot of resources to this. They have unlimited resources almost in terms of money, personnel, cyber capabilities to try and engage in disinformation operations. They just start from a weaker base when it comes to targeting Canada, I would say.
Mr. Gahir, you're muted.
Great, so you can't hear my question. So the question is, does Russian manipulation go as deep as to reach ethnic communities within Canada? Because obviously there's quite sizable minority populations within Canada. The reason I ask this is because, Pearson Airport is in my riding. My constituency has a high proportion of immigrants, and I have these conversations often where some of these conversations that I have seems to be parroting a lot of this disinformation that's coming from Russia. So I'm wondering, has it ricocheted off something else to reach them, or are they directly being targeted?
I think there's two answers to that question. One is some of it is definitely directly targeted, but I think that takes place more in the field of transnational repression, which you've heard about a bit from some of the other witnesses, where there are members of the Russian diaspora who are identified as aggressively anti-Putin or anti the Russian illegal invasion of Ukraine. The Russian government would do whatever it could to try and stifle those kinds of criticisms or contend, or counter them. More broadly, their disinformation efforts, I would argue, are a kind of subset of what they're attempting to do in the United States. In other words, deepen polarization, introduce doubts about the validity and viability of democratic governance. I think that the Canadian playbook for Russian disinformation is essentially a copy on a smaller scale of their playbook directed against the United States.
Thank you, Mr. Gahir.
Great, thank you.
On y va maintenant, Madame Michaud. Allez-y, s'il vous plaît.
Over to Ms. Michaud. You have 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. My question is for Mr. Oksanen. A previous witness, Mr. Tchaikovskov, shared something that was posted on Twitter recently. It was some sort of a billboard in Italy where one could see in many Italian cities that Russia is not our enemy. And there was an image of a handshake with the flags of both countries between Russia and Italy. And also on those billboards, people were encouraged to stop helping Ukraine by funding its war effort. So from what I heard to this point today from witnesses, the propaganda messages, the disinformation here in Canada is much more subtle. It says that Ukraine is corrupt and that sort of thing. But I was wondering, given that you're in Sweden, is that the type of ads that you see in your surrounding cities? We talked about France and Germany that are particularly targeted. Is it the case in Sweden as well? Do you see that type of billboard or ad? Do you see it frequently? And that being the case, how do governments react? And how should they react? Over to you.
Well, what the Russians are doing here, the main aim is to break the support of Ukraine. And here they work with different methods in different countries. You were mentioning Italy. That's another context, another situation, another kind of support for Russia to push that kind of advertisements. That will not work in Sweden. It will not work in the Nordic Baltic countries. Instead, you can see narratives like Ukraine will lose. That kind of narrative. Time is on Russia's side. We could save lives if Ukraine gave territory for peace. That kind of argument is what you're seeing pro-Russian persons, outlets, media outlets, and so on, pushing in that context. But this differs, of course, in what country you're talking about. And Italy has a long tradition of Russian influence, and we have seen more political parties being more positive towards Russia in Italy than in Sweden. In Sweden, it would be a political disaster to do that.
Et peut-être pour revenir sur la deuxième partie de la question,
And regarding the second part of my question, how should governments react to that type of propaganda? Because I do understand that some governments may be pro-Ukrainian, others pro-Russia. In France, 2 years ago, I saw frequent messages claiming that we should support Russia over Ukraine. So what roles should governments play? And I understand that there is a fine line between what we can do and respecting freedom of speech and local laws, but what should governments do against that?
Thank you, Madam, for reminding me about the second part of the question there. I think governments should be very clear on why is Russia doing this, what is at stake, to have that frank and sincere conversation with the citizens. We are in a situation right now when the democratic world is in a conflict with authoritarian states, especially Russia, but also we have other states like China and so on. We should be very clear in communicating to the citizen what is going on, what is at stake. And then, of course, also overlook what kind of regulations do we have within society that we could use without infringe what we're trying to save and protect the democracy. So this is a delicate balance. And of course, I will not go into the Canadian debate here, but in general terms, I think we must have leaders in society to be very clear what's going on.
Sorry, there's a bit of a confusion with the time. Your time was going up, not down. Anyway, merci, Madame. Mr. McGregor. It's one of those Scottish names. They're terrible.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yes. 2 minutes and a half, and we'll draw the line there. Thank you.
Okay, I appreciate it. Mr. Oksanen, I'd like to turn back to you again. In one of our previous meetings, one of our witnesses was talking about how Canada needs to enact a national digital resilience strategy. So there's certainly some sectors of Canadian society that are recognizing the scope of the challenge that's before us. And just with respect to the Psychological Defense Agency, I think Professor Warwick said it does sound a little bit Orwellian, and certainly that might be a little bit of criticism that we might face from certain sectors of society. So I'm curious, since this agency was created in Sweden, how has the public's reaction been to it? Is there sort of a general consensus that this is the tool that is needed for this moment in time? And I guess over the 2 years of its existence, how has there been any shift in public opinion on that agency's role in Swedish society and its necessity to counteract Russian threats?
Just let me first to take some historical background, because this agency might be new now, but it is an old agency that was scrapped during the eternal peacetime. So the history of the Psychological Defense Agency and its predecessor goes back to early 50s. when Cold War was coming back again and Sweden drew on the conclusions and the experiences that we draw during World War II, when we had radio propaganda from Nazi Germany, from Soviet Union into our society and so on. So this has a long tradition. And it is also very intertwined in the Swedish total defense concept that we also communicate with our citizens that we will never surrender if we get into war. Communications that we started back in 1943, and actually today it was published, the next version of this brochure that will be distributed to everyone in the population if the war comes or if the crisis comes. It is some 30 pages of brochure. These 2 years, I wouldn't say that the perception have changed of the agency. It was installed with a broad political support. So I would say it's accepted, but it's trying to find its role within the Swedish society and the government system. Of course, a new agency finding the relationship with other agencies takes some time.
Thank you, Mr. McGregor. And thank you to our witnesses for appearing today, and thank you for your testimony. It's very helpful. A couple of items of committee business before we carry on. The clerk has distributed this morning 2 draft budgets in the amount of $20,250 for the study on Russian interference and disinformation campaigns in Canada, and $1,500 for the study of growing problem of car thefts in Canada. Is it the will of the committee to adopt these budgets? Carried. There you go. I'd also like to announce that the next version of the auto theft study is going to be ready in the next probably day, and it will be distributed to the committee as soon as it's available. So thank you all. We are adjourned.